two European populations both carry the same reputation, living relics of ancient Europe, genetically isolated for thousands of years, each one popularly described as the closest thing science has to a time capsule of the continent's earliest inhabitants. The Basques, tucked into the mountains between Spain and France, speaking a language unrelated to anything else on Earth. The Sardinians, isolated on an island off the coast of Italy, surrounded by water that kept much of the outside world at arm's length for thousands of years, both get called Europe's oldest bloodline, sometimes in the very same documentaries, sometimes by the very same researchers. Only one claim can actually hold up completely once you look at what the genetics really show, and the real answer is more interesting than picking a simple winner. This is the real science comparing Basque and Sardinian DNA, and what oldest actually means once you define it properly, rather than treating it as a single simple contest with one obvious winner. Here's the assumption both populations get saddled with in popular science coverage. Isolated geography, a language or culture that never fully assimilated into the surrounding region, and a reputation for genetic distinctiveness get bundled together into a single, simple story, ancient population, untouched by later migration, essentially frozen in time since the Ice Age, as though isolation were one uniform phenomenon that worked identically everywhere it occurred. It's a satisfying narrative, the kind that travels well in headlines and documentary voiceovers. It's also not quite accurate for either population, and the specific ways it's inaccurate turn out to matter a great deal once you actually compare the two side by side. Start with Sardinia, because the research here is remarkably direct. In 2014, a team led by geneticists Iosif Lazaridis and David Reich, analyzing ancient European genomes alongside modern population data and publishing their findings in the journal Nature, identified Sardinians as the closest living genetic match to Europe's early Neolithic farmers. The population that spread agriculture across the continent after migrating from Anatolia roughly 8,000 years ago. Mainland European populations absorbed substantial later genetic input from Bronze Age, steppe migrations. Arriving from the Pontic-Caspian region around 5,000 years ago, a wave of pastoralist herders that swept across the continent and layered new ancestry on top of the original farming population almost everywhere it reached. Sardinia, protected by open water rather than land borders, absorbed far less of that later wave. Modern Sardinians today carry a genetic profile sitting closer to that original Neolithic farming population than any other European group studied, making the island something close to a living genetic snapshot of Europe. Before the Bronze Age transformed everyone else, a reference population geneticists now regularly use as a stand-in for ancient Neolithic ancestry when studying other populations across the continent. Now turn to the Basques, and the picture, while still pointing toward deep isolation, tells a meaningfully different story. A 2015 study led by geneticists Torsten Günther and Cristina Valdiosera, sequencing ancient genomes recovered from El Portolón cave in northern Spain, part of the Atapuerca archaeological complex, and publishing their results in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found that modern Basques trace their closest ancestry to the same broad category of population, Neolithic farmers, rather than to the older Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who occupied the region before farming ever arrived. That finding overturned decades of assumption, built largely on Basque language isolation and unusual blood type frequencies, that Basques represented an unbroken line back to Ice Age Europe, a theory that had circulated in anthropology since well before modern DNA sequencing existed. Like Sardinia, Basque isolation came from a real geographic barrier, in this case the mountainous terrain of the Western Pyrenees, that limited how much later migration reached the population. Unlike Sardinia, that isolation was never absolute. Iberia remained connected to the rest of mainland Europe by land the entire time, meaning some degree of Bronze Age steppe migration did reach Basque ancestors, just at a reduced level compared to surrounding regions, rather than being blocked almost entirely the way Sardinia's ocean crossing blocked it. Here's the deeper layer that actually decides which population holds the stronger claim, and the honest answer depends entirely on which specific kind of oldest you're asking about. If the question is which population's genome carries the least amount of later post-Neolithic admixture, the strongest, most consistent answer across the population genetics literature points to Sardinia, protected by water in a way no mountain range fully replicates on a connected landmass. Multiple independent studies since Lazaridis and Reich's original work have reinforced the same basic finding, using different samples and different statistical methods, and consistently arriving at the same conclusion about Sardinia's unusually preserved ancestry. If the question is instead about unbroken cultural and linguistic continuity, the answer swings firmly toward the Basques. Euskara, the Basque language, remains the only confirmed language isolate left standing anywhere in Western Europe, with no proven relationship to any other language family on the continent or beyond, a genuinely singular linguistic fact with no real parallel anywhere else on the continent. Sardinian, despite the island's unusually preserved genetics, is a Romance language, descended from Latin like Italian, French, and Spanish, meaning Rome's political and linguistic influence reached the island's culture even while its genetics stayed comparatively undisturbed underneath. Picture two separate groups of early farmers, both ultimately descended from the same broad Neolithic migration wave that carried agriculture out of Anatolia and across the Mediterranean roughly 8,000 years ago, spreading generation by generation along coastlines and river valleys into new territory. One group settles on a large island, surrounded on every side by open water, that later migrations, armies, and herding populations found far harder to cross in large numbers than a simple overland route, a natural moat requiring real maritime effort to breach at any real scale. The other group settles into rugged mountain valleys on the mainland, connected by land to the rest of Europe the entire time, but protected just enough by difficult terrain and a stubbornly maintained cultural identity to absorb new arrivals more slowly than the flatter, more accessible regions surrounding them, generation after generation, choosing continuity over easy assimilation even when the option to blend in was sitting right at their doorstep. Thousands of years later, geneticists studying both populations find genuinely deep, genuinely unusual isolation in each, just produced by two different mechanisms, water in one case, mountains and cultural persistence in the other, each leaving its own distinct signature in the genome. Here's the twist that keeps this comparison honest rather than settling for a simple winner. Sardinia's isolation was passive, a product of geography that required no active resistance. Water simply made large-scale migration difficult by default, a barrier that would have worked the same way regardless of what the island's inhabitants actually wanted or believed. Basque isolation, by contrast, appears to have been at least partly active, maintained through a persistent, distinct cultural and linguistic identity that resisted assimilation, even when the physical opportunity for outside contact was readily available by land. Rome never fully incorporated the Basque country the way it incorporated the rest of Iberia, but not because Roman soldiers couldn't physically reach the region, and historical records make clear Rome was fully capable of establishing at least some presence there. The Basque population and culture simply proved unusually resistant to the kind of full absorption that reshaped language, religion, and eventually genetics almost everywhere else Rome touched, a difference in outcome that geography alone can't fully explain. Each population also carries its own separate, well-documented genetic superlative beyond the basic how old question. The Basque country holds the highest recorded frequency of ORT-negative blood type anywhere in the world, a trait connected to that same deep, unusually preserved ancestral signal, first noticed by researchers testing blood samples in the region back in the 1940s, decades before anyone had the tools to explain why the numbers looked so different from the rest of Europe. Sardinia, meanwhile, has become a major focus of longevity research, containing one of the world's few scientifically recognized blue zones, a region in the island's Ogliastra area, with an unusually high concentration of people living past 100, including a notably high rate of male centenarians rarely matched anywhere else studied, a pattern researchers are still working to fully untangle between this same distinctive genetic isolation and specific longevity-associated gene variants that appear to have concentrated in the population alongside everything else. So which population is really Europe's oldest bloodline? The honest, complete answer is that they're each the oldest at a different, equally real thing. Sardinia holds the strongest claim to genetic purity in the strictest sense, the least diluted surviving snapshot of what a European population looked like right after farming arrived, and before the Bronze Age reshuffled everyone else's ancestry. The Basques hold the strongest claim to unbroken cultural and linguistic continuity, an identity, and a language that never assimilated into the wider currents reshaping the rest of the continent, even while their genome absorbed somewhat more outside influence than Sardinia's ever did. Neither population actually needs to win this comparison for the real story to be remarkable. Both are living proof that European history didn't move at one uniform speed everywhere at once. While the rest of the continent kept absorbing wave after wave of new migration, new language, and new ancestry, two very different landscapes, one surrounded by sea, one wrapped in mountains and cultural persistence, each managed to hold on to their own separate fragment of an older Europe. Still measurable, still distinct, and still, in their own particular ways, both genuinely deserving of the title everyone keeps trying to give to just one of them. Perhaps the more useful question was never which population is oldest, but what oldest is actually supposed to measure in the first place. Ask a population geneticist working purely from ancestry proportions, and Sardinia wins clearly, backed by consistent findings, across more than a decade of published research. Ask a linguist studying the surviving language families of Europe, and the Basques win just as clearly, a fact no genetic study could ever overturn. Both answers are correct, measuring genuinely different things, and both point to the same underlying truth about how history actually unfolds. It rarely erases the past evenly. It leaves it scattered in uneven pockets, an island here, a mountain range there, each one preserving whichever piece of the older world happened to be shielded by whatever barrier, geographic or cultural, stood in history's way long enough to matter.